This is your one big chance to go change things, is to go cast your vote. And and then if the vote doesn't go the way you want, or if you feel the vote was stolen or was fraudulent, right? People will take up arms.
So let's start with the Cataline conspiracy or Cataline conspiracy. How do you pronounce it?
I would say Cataline.
All right. So for people who don't know what it is at all, let's tell the story to sort of set the scene of this.
Yeah, so the Cataline conspiracy was basically an attempt by a disgruntled, disappointed politician in the Roman Republic to basically to take over the state illegally. So I don't know how far back we want to go, but we're in the year 63 BC. And actually, Catiline in that year ran for the office of consul. This is the top office in the Roman Republic. There are two each year. He'd actually already run for the consulship the year before, in the year 64 BC, and he was defeated in that year. And sort of adding to his humiliation, he was defeated by the new man, Cicero. So a new man was somebody who'd never been in politics before, came from a family that was new to the scene in Rome. So this really irritated Catiline. And in 63 BC, he ran again for the second time and he lost. So really already at this point, he's sort of thinking about how can I gain power if things don't go my way in the elections. And he'd been in touch with sort of an army that was forming in northern Italy, and spoke with them. And after he lost the consulship, a little bit afterwards, he head up and joined them. And the plan was then to go back and kill Cicero and take over Rome. So that's a very short summary. We can get into some of the specifics here. There's sort of a lot going on at the time, of course.
Isn't one of the tensions between Cicero and Catiline sort of how they approach even running for office, right? Cicero runs an honest campaign, at least by Roman standards. And as I understand it, Catiline is sort of playing it the way that it was always played back then.
Yeah, so Cicero, I mean, part of what makes this so fascinating is they really are, as you suggest, kind of very different characters, right? And it's sort of hard to imagine the whole situation developing without these two personalities. So just to sort of describe them a little bit, Catiline was a patrician. He was born into one of these families that could trace their ancestry back to the foundation of the Republic. It's like a Mayflower family or something. Sure. In the United States. And he had this sort of tremendous pride, but the family had really fallen on hard times. They hadn't hit the top office for centuries. So he was determined to recover their fortunes, and he would do whatever he possibly could. And he sort of had an unsavory rise to power in a period of civil war in which he killed several men, confiscated property. This was how he came to power, or was trying to rise up to power. So Cicero, right, totally different. As we said, he's a new man. So he's from this sort of one of these small towns of Italy and prides himself on his virtue. And he rose in politics really by his own hard work and had to make a name for himself, literally had to make a name for himself in the courts. So Cicero, very much when he ran for the consulship, he saw it all about calling in favors, reminding the Roman people of various things he'd done for them. One thing he did do, where by our standards he might seem a little dirty, is he very much sort of smeared Catiline's character And this was kind of very much in the nature of Roman politics at the time. So Catiline, in the first bid for the consulship, he lost. Then in 63, he ran again, and he'd been involved with bribery and other illicit plans to gain office. But what he did in 63 was he then sort of very unexpectedly kind of ran on a platform of total debt cancellation. Rome was experiencing a credit crisis at the time, and he said, let's just wipe all the debts out. And that was very antithetical to Cicero's ideas of how the Roman state should be run, and sort of even his most basic ideas about fairness.
Yeah, it seems like there's sort of a mix. Ironically, even though Cicero is the new man, he very much venerates the old system and the old way. And Catiline, who wants power more than anything, is really willing to claim and do anything and betray the what is it, the mos maiorum, however possible to advance himself.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And but Catiline's not totally alone in this. I mean, another name, very famous name, obviously, to bring in here would be Julius Caesar, right? Who also came from a patrician family. So, Caesar claims we go back to the goddess Venus and her son Aeneas, the Trojan, right? The founder of the Roman people. But the family for centuries, once again, had been pretty obscure. They actually hadn't been the greatest generation, in the fighting in the Punic War and making Rome the powerful empire that it was. So Caesar, Catiline, there's sort of a personality type there, right? That is very, has this sort of sense of grievance, right? Our
Yes.
family should be in charge, and we're not. And then so they'll do what it takes, right, to gain power, and they may very well sort of cultivate, as both of these politicians did, sort of cultivate ordinary Romans in kind of a sort of more radical democratic appeal than somebody like a Cicero would have approved of.
Epictetus said that philosophy wasn't this dry, abstract thing. It was a thing, he said, you should be talking about, writing down, reading about, exploring with other people all the time. He said, constantly have it at hand. That's how I think about philosophy. And it's weird. For the last 5 years, every single day, I've been writing this free email about Stoic philosophy. It's been not just cool to meet all these fellow practitioners of Stoic philosophy, but in writing about it, talking about it, reading it for our podcast, I have got to internalize these ideas in a way that I never would have been able to under any other circumstances. That's the idea. Philosophy is something you're supposed to engage in, not keep in these dusty old books or read once and be done with. It's a constant process. And I think that's why the email has worked so well for the people reading about it and sharing it and talking about it, all of that as well. So I'd love to have you join us on this email. You can sign up at dailystoic.com/daily email. It's totally free, no spam. You can unsubscribe whenever you want. I've basically given away a book for free every single year for 5 years, and I'm gonna keep on doing it until I drop dead. Check it out, dailystoic.com/daily email. So Catiline loses the election and then engages in, I guess in the ancient world, they sort of called it a war. You call it a conspiracy, but there is this attempt to say, no, the election is incorrect. I deserve to be in power. How far is Catiline willing to go to make this real? Like, how real is the threat to the Roman Republic in your view?
Yeah, so this is a sort of a controversial question, and part of why it's controversial is sort of at the time, and especially afterwards, all these stories came out. Oh, back a few years earlier, Catiline was planning to kill the consuls. So there becomes kind of a fog of allegations. But I think it's quite clear. So he lost a second time. He was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was clear that he could not run again. So I think there's really no doubt, certainly no doubt in my mind, that at that point he was prepared to seize power by force. And so what his plan was is there was sort of this army gathering in northern Italy. Ultimately it was about 10,000 people, perhaps. So using the term war is fair in this context. But what Catiline was planning to do was he went to northern Italy to meet up with these sort of disgruntled farmers who were trying to get their debts forgiven. That's part of why they were up in arms. And he illegally seized the fasces. This is the bundle of rods that are carried around by the duly elected consuls that are the symbol of their power. Right. We later get the word fascism from this, of
Ah,
course, because Mussolini, right, used the ancient Roman bundle of rods as his symbol of power. So Catiline clearly usurped the top office illegally and was sort of marching around Italy as if he was the consul, and was sort of planning to come back to Rome. And he'd left behind a few supporters, and what they were supposed to do was sort of carry out acts of arson, terrorism, kill some of the leading politicians, kind of create enough chaos that Catiline could then return with the army and take over
and,
politics.
and this culminates in one of the most epic scenes, I guess, not just in Roman history, but more directly, I guess you might call it in ancient literature, the O Catiline speech. Do you mean how much longer are you going to continue to abuse
Yeah.
us? How much longer will this madness go on? Shame on the age and the principles. So is this Cicero's fate? Uh, Finest hour? Is this his Churchillian sort of calling out of what's happening? How do you see the speech, and what does that speech mean?
Yeah. So for Cicero, there was no doubt about it that this was his finest hour. And he maintained that to his dying day. You can read his letters where he talks about the glory of what he did. Um, so was it his finest hour? He gave these fantastic speeches. They're masterpieces. He published them himself later. Another sign of just how proud he was of all of this. Um, and students still learn Latin using these speeches today. They've been an inspiration to orders ever since. You can find uh, U.S. politicians in the antebellum period, for example, modeling their orations on Cicero. So he was very proud of it. But the catch was, so he gave these great speeches, but
He basically
also at the
calls
same.
out Catiline, who's in the audience, right?
Yeah. So in the very first speech, yeah, Catiline sort of slunk into the Senate, and this was quite a dramatic one, because according to Cicero and all later historians writing about this, actually that morning, probably that very morning, a couple of Catiline's associates had come to Cicero's house and were planning to kill him, and Cicero had been tipped off. So he knew in advance, so he took proper security measures. So then he went into the Senate and revealed this, right? So this is part of
Sure.
the
This is high
fireworks of the
drama.
speech. It's incredibly high drama. Yeah. I mean, you can sort of, substitute modern names and imagine the effect of this. If the Speaker of the House showed up in the US Congress and said that a disgruntled candidate for office or whatever was trying to
Sure.
kill her, right? I mean, yeah. So it's um, incredibly dramatic speech, and but is Cicero the Winston Churchill, right? That was the question you asked.
Yeah.
Is it his finest hour? So he thinks it is, and a few of his friends think it is. But the problem was, to do, especially with a few of those associates of Catiline who stayed behind in Rome. So this is after Catiline left. The mask dropped. It was totally clear what he was up to. But he'd left behind these associates in Rome, and Cicero carried out this kind of sting to secure written evidence that would prove the guilt of those staying behind in Rome with these plans to torch the city. And what happened was we can talk more about this, but essentially after they were arrested, the Senate voted to execute five of Catiline's associates who were back in Rome. And Cicero carried out the order immediately. The problem was he potentially, arguably, was in violation of Roman law, which said that all citizens must have a trial before their lives are ever taken. So this could be used against Cicero and was used against him by his enemies afterwards. And even among the Roman people, right, ordinary citizens, there were doubts about Cicero's leadership that could be stoked. So I think that's why he doesn't quite, come out of this as a Winston Churchill or an Abraham Lincoln, right? Who also is suppressing insurrection, but Lincoln maintains that strong sense of constitutionality, right? And Cicero doesn't. And he would say, well, we had to take extraordinary measures. But the result was it even kind of crippled him politically later because he was in fear of what would happen to him as a result.
I have this theory about history that you get this first view of history and it's very simple, right? It's like there was an attempted conspiracy and Cicero shut it down and he gave this epic speech and that's what we should learn from it. And then you study a little bit more and you're like, it's so much more complicated. Was Cicero trumping it up to make it more than it was so he could be great? Does he violate the Constitution, or the constitutional norms, et cetera, et cetera? Right. And then it kind of gets muddled. And then you kind of study it some more. You step back from it and you're like, well, there was a coup and he did stand up for it. And what else was he supposed to do? Do you know what I mean? It's like the Civil War was about slavery. And then it's like, well, it was more complicated than that. And then it's like, it really was just about slavery, And so I kind of am, depending on the day, I think something very differently of the conspiracy, right? Because it's like, I feel like the first time I heard it, Cicero was heroic. Then I began to study Cicero's character more. And I'm like, I don't trust anything this guy says. He's always trying to make it about him and is so consumed with his legacy. And then even watching more recent political events, you're sort of like, well, what else was he supposed to do? Right? I don't know. What do you think about it?
Yeah. So I think, right, it's so easy for us, sitting in our studies as readers of these events, right, to make judgments on, Cicero should have done this, and if only he'd done that, and I think so. I've written a new translation of sort of the classic account of the conspiracy, which is by the historian Sallust, and this was kind of written about 20 years later. Sallust was sort of making his debut as a history writer, and I think the neat thing about Sallust's book, right, is he does sort of get into those complexities, right? Without undermining, sort of, as you said, the basic idea that there was a conspiracy. It was pretty alarming, right? That this could even take place in Rome. Is sort of, what is this saying about the Roman Republic and its health? So you can have all of that on the one hand. But then if you're an attentive student of history, right, and perhaps a future leader, you can sort of learn a little bit from some of the mistakes that Cicero probably made. So, but yeah, surely it's so much easier for us in hindsight to think. And I think Lincoln is a good example here, right, of somebody who, tended to get things a little more right, in my opinion, than Cicero, but certainly had to make very hard decisions that were criticized at the time and have been criticized afterwards.
Yeah, you think about Lincoln and Cicero both being lawyers. I think part of what they may have both been hesitant about, or it's this sort of tricky thing that we don't, is like, how do you litigate, or do you want to argue the validity of the claims of a person attempting to overthrow the government, right? Like that was, I think, Lincoln's trouble at the end of the Civil War, but also throughout the Civil War. It's sort of like there are these exigent circumstances. There is this moment of life and death. And should the leader of the state be held essentially forced to allow the state to tear itself apart or commit suicide or not defend itself because it's worried? Calling them legal proprieties sounds like dismissive of their significance, but you wonder if that's what it's like. These people were about to overthrow the government, murder me, and I'm supposed to, not just give them their day in court, but I'm supposed to allow their sedition oxygen to potentially spread and infect the rest of the republic. I imagine that, as a philosopher and as a leader, which both Lincoln and Cicero were, that must have been an incredibly difficult position to find oneself in.
Yeah. I think that's where I am a bit more sympathetic to Cicero than sometimes later generations have been, who've seen this purely as well, it goes back to the idea that Cicero was the new man. So, he needed to make a name for himself. So he sort of almost cooked up this whole thing and invented it. And I think, to me, that just really doesn't work. I think he faced this situation and he had to deal with it. Lincoln, right, as well, he knew what he was getting into. He was in the new Republican Party. He'd gotten back into politics, but he didn't know exactly what was going to happen in 1861. And he has to go and deal with it. And he faces, again, I'm not trying to say Cicero is a Lincoln. I think a lot more highly of Lincoln, but Lincoln faced difficult choices too, right? I mean, he felt he had to keep the border states on side. And that meant, not doing anything initially about slavery, even though personally he found that institution abhorrent. So these are sort of the what I would say are kind of, the Machiavellian
yes.
Questions that leaders faced in the true sense of the word Machiavellian, not just petty little schemes, right? But
how do you run a state?
Yeah. And when your state's survival is on the line, right? Where, what is the morality, right? And do you do what you have to do or what you think you have to do to keep your state safe, to allow it to survive? I mean, that's what, Machiavelli is getting at in his philosophy. And to me has always sort of made Lincoln kind of a true Machiavellian leader.
I think what is impressive about Lincoln is that he is deeply principled and pragmatic, which are two, like you might argue Cicero is almost is incredibly pragmatic, very rarely principled, although he is, by the standards of his day, remarkably uncorrupt, compared to Catiline, which I think is to his credit. But one thing that's always kind of been a swing vote for me here is, at least in that particular sort of, should the executions, are they legal, not legal? Is Cicero power mad? Is Cato signs off on them. And Cato seems to have almost always be virtuous to a fault, in the sense of like sticks with precedent, procedure, the old way of doing things. I don't get much of a sense of any other of the examples that we hear about from Cato that he was like, Cato almost never says anything Machiavellian, never says anything where the ends justify the means. And he gives Cicero the green light to proceed. So that does make me think that the facts on the ground were perhaps more conducive to Cicero's point of view than we might hear after the fact.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And Cato, appropriately for us here, on the Daily Stoic, right? Cato is one of the heroes. And in fact, I mean, Cicero is sort of disappointed a little bit afterwards because he felt Cato's part was sort of almost overinflated.
Yes.
And, this ended up robbing Cicero of some of the credit that he deserved, right? But in all seriousness, yeah, so the Senate is sort of meeting on December 5th of the year 63, and these guys have been caught red-handed, the ones in Rome. I mean, there is evidence. It's, as I say in the book, it's a bit like the smoking gun tape in the Watergate scandal. I mean, there's just no doubt about it, about what they're up to, really. So, but the Senate is cautious and sort of wavering a little bit. What are we going to do? And Cato, just towards the end of the debate, came in and gave the speech of his life. Everyone said this afterwards, and said, in Roman private law, if you catch somebody in the middle of a crime, you kill them with impunity. Now, these are Roman standards, and they're not going to map perfectly onto our own sense of due process and presumption of innocence. Romans didn't really have a penal system as we think about it. Even high-profile criminals or those going on trial didn't have to. They weren't detained, right? So part of the situation here is there weren't necessarily great options. But Cato came in and gave this speech saying, this is what we need to do. This will nip everything in the bud. And Cato was proven right, essentially. I mean, after word reached this army in northern Italy that was growing, that the Senate had taken a hard line, many of the supporters of Catiline vanished. They peeled off. So
it sort of melt back into the fold.
Right. But it's not. So afterwards, it's really not that anybody ever could come to the defense of the conspirators so much as that Cicero could be, for political reasons, could be attacked as the consul who'd carried out the sentence of execution, which was of concern to ordinary citizens, right? Who didn't necessarily have lots of wealth, say, in Rome, but they prided themselves on the right that they had to be tried before they ever lost their lives.
Well, and one of the complicating factors I have to imagine, because we're sort of talking about how the history of something gets written, is Cicero's enormous ego, right? And his just general unlikability. Because I wrote about this in Lives of the Stoics. I love this quote from Plutarch. He talks about Cicero's sort of celebration of himself, and he says, "One couldn't attend a Senate or public meeting nor any session of the courts without having to listen to the endless repetition. This unpleasing habit of his clung to him like fate." That he just, he's even writing to other historians of the time, like Posidonius. He's like, here's my notes. Here's what happened. We have this idea that victors write that history is written by the victors. It's almost as if, and doesn't Churchill say like, I intend to write it of history. But it's like Cicero tries.
History will be kind to me,
yes,
because I intend to write it. Yeah.
It's like Cicero is so ham-fisted about it and over the top about it that it almost creates a backlash in which the rest of Rome has to downplay the significance of the event so as just not to have to make Cicero so insufferable.
Yeah. No, I think you have a good point, and I like the bit of Plutarch, and there are other examples. Maybe it's Seneca. I can't remember. I think Seneca, who says, right, that Cicero praised himself not without reason, but without end. So it's like, okay, Cicero, you're allowed to take a victory lap, but this is again sort of the Lincoln. I mean, think of the second inaugural. That's not a victory lap for Lincoln. I mean, a very different.
But there's a humility and a grace to it that Cicero seemed to lack.
Yeah, he and So ancient politicians are different. They have to promote their names. I mean, modern ones do, of course, but the ethics were different. Yeah, but there you never get the sense of sort of the magnanimity, right,
Yes.
of Cicero, right, which is what you see with I think Lincoln and Churchill at the end of World War II, since we mentioned him, right? The victor should be magnanimous, right?
Yeah,
And
there's that term like greatness of soul. I forget what it is, but it felt like at the Cicero was a small man pretending to be great rather than a great man meeting a great moment. You know, there's a kind of a play actingness to it. And to me, the thing about Cicero that it's always struck me about the Catalan conspiracy that makes me think of it again, like sort of going back and forth, but it's like, it's almost as if he wastes himself on this crisis, right? And although I guess you could argue Cicero or Churchill has the same tendency, but then, when the actual coup happens, when the republic is being overthrown by Caesar, Cicero's sort of like out of gas. He's like eating up all his credibility. The man in the moment should meet, but the man, the man has used up everyone's patience, and he can't do it.
yeah, and I think it's a great point, and I think it's even especially true sort of in the immediate aftermath when Caesar is just starting to rise to power, and Cicero wanted to take a stand, but that's when he's sort of fearful about what's going to happen to me, and he sort of had counteracted his own influence. But I will say, in Cicero's defense, right, the old man did have one fight left in him, and of course, in after Caesar's death, he comes back out and sticks his neck out again, and that's part of why I think um, you can take Cicero bashing too far, because
Sure.
in the year 44, I mean, his critic will say he was so vain. He needed that one last
Yeah.
chance to kind of restore his reputation. But I think it's really just the opposite. In 44, he could have stayed at his villas. He had a nice thing going on there, writing his philosophy, and he said, no, I'm going to come back out and give this one last shot, and he paid for it with his life and died a brave death.
Yeah, he's just such a complicated figure,
Yeah,
uh, and it's like he's right in theory, but then it's sort of kind of out of character, and then when it is in character, people doubt it. I think ambition is this thing where we admire people who are ambitious, but they can't be too ambitious. They need to be able to make it look kind of effortless. There's that word sprezzatura, right? The sort of
yeah,
effortlessness, and Cicero wanted it so bad and was so naked about it that I think it made people doubt his motives, and it made them uh, sort of look at him suspiciously, and I think it kind of created the backlash or the mischaracterization that he ended up having to spend so much time fighting against. Like they don't invite him into the conspiracy to assassinate Caesar because they don't think he can keep a secret, and they're kind of proven right because he ends up taking credit for it anyway afterwards.
yeah, yeah. No, for sure. Cicero is. I mean, some of it, just to sort of give a slightly more
Yeah.
sympathetic read, right? Is some of it is that he sort of had to develop those instincts as a new man,
Mm.
right? Who never should have been elected to the consulship in the first place, because the noble families pretty much had a stranglehold on that top office, and he rose to the top by promoting himself. He had to; nobody else was going to, and so and and that makes his early career. I mean, I'm with you. I think he is sort of fiendishly complicated, and that makes him interesting. I think his early career sort of before Catiline, before the conspiracy, is sort of the part that's easiest to be cheering him on for, right? When he's just sort of coming into the courts and sort of figuring out, well, how do I take on the nobility to make my own name, um, without jeopardizing kind of my chances completely? And he does some better things, some unambiguously good things, I think, earlier in his career.
Yeah, I mean, if the question is, would Rome have been better with more Ciceros or less Ciceros, right? The answer is more Ciceros, whereas Rome needed fewer Catalines, right? Like it's definitely better than the average or the status quo. Just like a Shakespearean character, he has these sort of tragic flaws that are so connected to his virtues. That's kind of the irony of it, as you're saying. It's like what allowed him to break through and be the only one to accomplish what is also what it's not paralyzes him, but it traps him in this kind of cycle where he gets so close, but he never quite gets it.
Right. Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. And this is why this period of Roman history, after all, was one Shakespeare was drawn to. Now,
Yes,
admittedly,
sure.
his Cicero is kind of a bit of a wimp in Julius Caesar, but yeah, but Shakespeare sees that these figures, and there are others. Cato is a great example, whom Shakespeare really didn't touch on, right? But whose great virtues end up also being their fatal flaws. Caesar, Brutus, right? I mean, you can sort of see it working out for all of them, and this is part of why the Republic would fail, right? Is you don't have it's hard to find the one you're sort of totally cheering for, who has
Yes.
that sense of virtue and the Machiavellian kind of pragmatism at the same time. But yeah, we needed more Ciceros.
If any of them were perfect, they wouldn't have been attracted to politics in the first place.
Right. There you go.
Yeah, I think have you read Mike Duncan's book, The Storm Before the Storm?
Yeah, actually, I haven't.
I had him on the podcast. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it. But basically, what he was talking about, and I think your work is an important part of this theory, is basically it's like we see Julius Caesar. The story we've told ourselves as Western civilization is, Julius Caesar comes and it's this clash, and then the Republic is overthrown. That it's sort of this one guy, this one event that changes Rome's history. But he's like, no, the 100 years of history before Julius Caesar is what's sowing the seeds or setting the scene for this thing to happen. So like the idea that Julius Caesar would come and do this, it's a lot less shocking if you understand that not that many years previous, Julius Caesar and Cato and Cicero are all battling about someone doing the exact same thing, right? Like that this sense of actually there was a century or so, or a generation or so of rising political violence, fraught political transition, and just a general breakdown of the order and the norms on both sides that create kind of an escalation that culminate in this event. It's not this one thing coming out of nowhere that changes everything.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that is for us in modern democracies is one of the takeaways of the Roman Republic, right? Is political violence, even if any one episode like the Catilinarian conspiracy, okay, the Republic went on for some years afterwards,
But
but
it's rooted.
cumulatively, yeah, this takes a huge toll. And and the problem, one of the problems, right, with political violence is as we were saying earlier, that the sort of choices leaders face and putting it down are terrible, and may involve violence on their part, and that creates the kind of spiral that can get you to a full civil war, because the government, even if it's doing the right thing for survival, can lose legitimacy in the process.
Yeah, it's like one breaking of the norms seems to necessitate or presents the opportunity for another breaking of norms. So, Catiline, disputes the results of the election, engages in political violence, he's menacing the Senate, and Cicero responds by suspending the sort of judicial process to put down the threat. And then it's not like Catiline and his supporters are like, oh, you know what, we were wrong, slap on the wrist, we're going back to how, right? Then now they have a grievance, right? We see this in the US with like Supreme Court justice, appoint. It's like it gets more and more extreme and the norms break down more and more because everyone is rooting their norm breaking or justifying their breaking of norms with the argument that so and so did it first.
Totally, yeah, and it becomes, the strategies make sense on any one side for the moment, but overall they end up devastating the political system. The basic idea of shared governance ceases to become possible. Peaceful shared governance, when each side starts taking these actions.
So, given the title of the book, "How to Stop a Conspiracy," what lessons do you think are there about how one stops that escalation or that cycle? Like, did Cicero do it right? Is there something he should have done differently? Like, how could Rome have pulled itself out of the spiral that ends with Caesar?
Yeah, right. I love questions like this, because if I truly had the answer, I really should be the president of the United States now or something, right? Not a classics professor. But so I do have one or two thoughts there, right? I mean, I think so one of the sort of great things, almost a joke in a way, about Sallust's book is so he gave a version of Cato's speech, saying you've got to take action now, otherwise the republic's fate is in the balance. But the other speech that Sallust recreated in the debate was the one of none other than Julius Caesar, right? Who also on this occasion got up and sort of warned the Senate about taking the immediate step of executions.
He's the voice of reason, unexpectedly.
Well, that's the thing, yeah, and obviously there's sort of some delicious kind of ironies there for the reader, because Sallust was writing after the Ides of March, after Caesar's assassination. But there is something to take away from Caesar's speech there, right? Which is respecting that a bad precedent is very likely to be abused. So you sort of want the Ciceronian cleverness, right? That, the way he patiently gathered the evidence to use against various of the conspirators to make it completely clear what they were doing, right? That's the part of Cicero that one can view sort of positively. But what Cicero might have done better, and in general might have done better, is afterwards not to break the law unnecessarily if possible, and sort of to return or to offer some more hopeful vision of shared governance. I mean, I think that's kind of what's missing from the year 63 and became missing from the partisanship of the late Roman Republic. You don't have, we go back to him, but you don't have the Gettysburg Address lurking anywhere in these texts, right? And that, the hard-nosed Machiavellian is going to say, well, that's not going to, do much, but I think it's all we have is to keep offering out that vision that can try to bring people together. And you have to address real problems and real grievances too. Who are the disaffected? Why are there thousands of people willing to take up arms? that's the kind of work Cicero didn't want to do as much, to really address those problems as well.
Yeah, it requires both empathy and a savvy, and the Stoics talk about controlling the passions. How does
Yeah.
one respond not out of anger or frustration or even punitively, but find a way to, like, both address the potentially devastating, uh, extra event, and sort of try to ratchet things down a little bit. But I think we're seeing now, like, it is interesting. You study it historically, and then you watch what's happening in the world now, and you go, is that even possible? Right? Like I think we're seeing that now, where when you realize people might pay lip service to wanting that, but what do you like? As I was thinking about this, having read a lot about the Civil War, there's this idea that Lincoln wants forgiveness and sort of malice towards them, etc. But what if the other side isn't reciprocating that, isn't receiving the gesture or the grace in good faith, and then the problem just continues, right? And I wonder if, as we look at this happening in the world now, like, can people say, "Oh, we just need someone who's calm and brings us together"? Well, what if the other side doesn't want to come together, right? What if they take advantage of the leniency and the mercy, and then you're just back in the same boat, and you miss that window, the window that Cicero has where he puts the thing down for good. What if you miss that window?
Yeah, you raise a great, sort of ask a great question there, and again, there's sort of not a simple response to that. I think it sort of goes back to your point, though, about kind of sort of the simplicities and then the complexities of these great historical events and processes, right? Because I mean, the U.S. Civil War ended, but of course, it's very clear, right, that the U.S. South still, I
It only
mean,
ended
was
militarily.
was experiencing, Black Americans were experiencing incredible amounts of violence for decades and decades after the U.S. Civil War. So, it the idea that any period of civil war, I think, maybe we can say this positively, is sort of going to end. The guns stop and everyone comes back together is probably impossible on
Yeah.
some level. But at least being aware of kind of the difficulty of the process is something leaders can deal with, right, and sort of act on.
I mean, to me, this whole period of Roman history is just a sobering reminder of how difficult it is to stop political violence once it started, and that the whole point of the democratic system, all of these things that were first pioneered back then, but gone through all these different iterations, all of it is about stopping political violence. Because the alternative is not like, oh, are we a democracy, or are we more socialist like the Nordic countries? It's like, you're either a democracy or you're a fascist state, or it's chaos with political violence. Do you know what I mean? Like the all of the systems of government are really about who has the monopoly on violence, and how does one keep violent, like, how does one prevent disputes from being settled with violence. And that the election and the different, all of these norms were inventions to stem violence. And that there's always that, but that violence is always there, just lurking beneath the surface, and once it gets out, it's hard to put it back.
Yeah, totally. And I think we have to, to accept, we sort of have the hopeful vision of peaceful shared governance. And I think democracies can do a better job at their best of sort of addressing different groups' interests and reconciling those. But I think we also have to acknowledge, and this is a takeaway again from Roman history, right, that the, the democratic forms of government can breed violence in their own ways because they're meant to stop it, but people in a democracy and in a republic, they have a sense, for example, that their vote ought to matter,
Yes.
right? Because that's what the system tells them, and this is your one big chance to go change things, is to go cast your vote, and then if the vote doesn't go the way you want, or if you feel the vote was stolen,
Yeah.
or was fraudulent, right? People will take up arms and or start to move in that direction. And so I think we have to. I'm not saying it with any pleasure, obviously, but I think it is something that you kind of can see that's tragic about the Roman Republic, right? Is as you say, there's sort of the great villains, right? But there's sort of also ways in which the system itself sort of could encourage individuals sometimes to think that violence was acceptable. It's a perversion, but a perversion of the system, right? Of the rhetoric of liberty or the ballot box or whatever we want to call it.
Or then as now, the mob is this kind of third rate. It's like how you're not allowed to talk about jury nullification in the judicial system, that it hinges kind of on this fiction or this story, and that like the mob is this thing that like the most important norm in any democratic system is we don't rile up the mob, right? Like that we don't feed lies to the mob, we don't weaponize the mob, we don't encourage or foment the mob, because the mob is really the ultimate enemy of a democracy. It's not other countries, it's not it, but the democracies get destroyed when the mob turns out and tears it down. And I think Catiline was fomenting the mob. What the Gracchus affair is sort of the fomenting of the mob. And then, the 2020 election and January 6th is what happens when you repeatedly lie to a mob, and all of a sudden, like the mob is acting rationally if what they're being told is true, right? And it's not, but if what they had been told was true, what happened on January 6th would make more sense, right? And so it's like that's the thing. The one thing beyond the pale has to be the cultivation or the manipulation of the mob.
Right, right, and this is sort of one of the points kind of Cicero and ancient political theory more generally, is that concern about sort of preventing the rise of a demagogue.
Yeah.
And I think this is where, maybe in the light of events really across the world in democracies in recent years, I'm somebody who, maybe 20 years ago, a sort of clever graduate student was just saying, "Oh, that windbag Cicero," but I've come to have a bit more sympathy kind of for his viewpoint about things, right?
Yeah.
That and the thing about angry crowds too, right, is it doesn't have to be the whole crowd, but sometimes it just takes a few.
Sure.
And then violence can sort of literally spread right through crowds. And of course, nowadays we have that phenomenon of the angry crowd online,
Yeah.
right, which is its own very dangerous phenomenon. In ancient Rome, obviously, it was sort of in the forum and the public spaces of the city. But it's that same problem, that if you get a few spreaders of misinformation, a few malicious actors, right, it can sort of start to take over the whole crowd, or enough people get incited that it becomes a problem.
When I think Roman history is sort of the story of that figure believing that they can get the mob to do what they want, and then realizing that they're not as in control of the mob as they thought that they were, right? So it's sort of like you're riding the tiger and you think you're in control, but you're not. And what happens, it's all bets are off once it gets going. And then we're sort of looking at the wreckage that this angry beast did. Um, and that strikes me as like let's say Cataline had been successful, right? Where could that have ended? Like the idea that he just would have become consul and ruled like any normal politician, and things would have settled down, strikes me as a rather naive notion.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think so there was this debt crisis going on at the time. And so you could say, right, oh, the most charitable version would have been Catalan would have come in and made some necessary reforms, helped people out. But I think that's very unlikely.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the danger that Cicero and Sallust, the historian writing afterwards, saw is that the character of our leaders really does matter. This is one of the other great insights that we take from classics, right? And you hear it nowadays, right? People say, "Well, I hate this leader's character, or the private life is terrible, or whatever," but some of the policies are good. And I mean, now I'm sounding a bit more like a Cicero than a Machiavelli here. Where is that going to end up, right?
Well, character is fate, as the expression goes. Like that.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, and what I think so interesting about what you're just saying is like you you think it's so like Cataline, I don't think thought about what would happen if he had succeeded. He was just thinking about like one little thing after, like he was just a little bit in front of him. Uh, and we've done a remarkable job not talking about current events, so I'm going to ruin our streak right now. But I think about this with Trump. Like, let's say Trump had somehow managed to flip a key number of people and overturn the election, right? The result would have still likely been political violence, only worse, because he would have actually just pulled off a coup, right? So like, right, like he would have effectively overturned a democratic election, one that he lost the popular and the electoral to, right? And how would the people on the other side have reacted? People who are not in the sway of the demagogue, people who did have objective facts in front of them and had witnessed this slow moving thing, and they were not in the cult of personality. They would have had to choose between accepting a legitimate election being illegitimately or fraudulently overthrown, or reacting, in either political violence or some mass form of protest, right? So I think what's so tricky about these figures is they're often so motivated by greed or ego or the lust for power, and they don't think about what's going to happen when they're not as strategic as you think they are, because they're so blinded by what they want. I just shudder to think, yeah, what would have happened if Catalan had succeeded? Or what if one or two, or I mean, it would have needed to be like 3 or 4 states, but let's say a slate of electors had been manipulated and the election is thrown to Congress or it's overturned. I mean, we don't just show up on January 7th and live in the same country anymore, right? Like chaos ensues there also.
yeah, yeah. It's a great question, and alarming to think about. But I think anyone can see just how badly it would have ended up. And at the same time, I think we sort of have to not just gasp in relief and say, well, thank God that didn't happen, but sort of think about already the damage that was done by getting just that getting so close to that point, even in the first place.
Well, and then I think the note that just because Catiline didn't succeed didn't mean that Rome could have rested easy, because as we were talking about, just a few years later, Caesar comes along. So if you get complacent, if you don't do something about it, uh, you know, uh, it just metastasizes and gets worse.
Totally.
Well, this was amazing, and I really want to have you back on. Maybe you can tease it, but I know you have a book coming on the that second conflict, the Cato and the Caesar. I would love to have a conversation with you about that book when it comes out.
Yeah, so that's coming out later this year, and it sort of looks at the two of the great the I think the dominant personalities actually of the late Roman Republic. Cicero looms very large because he produced these magnificent speeches that have been models for orators to follow ever since. Um, but actually, especially after the Catilinarian conspiracy and sort of the trouble he got into, he ceased to be a dominant figure really in politics. And what I'm trying to do in this book is everyone kind of acknowledges um, Caesar's role in what we would call the fall of the Roman Republic. And I'm trying to sort of to trace the story of his rivalry with Cato. And Cato, I think, was the other great leader of of that generation. And I think they sort of what I'm trying to do in the book is look at how their partisanship goes back to a point I was earlier making, how their partisanship will sort of each act at any one moment made sense for them politically, made sense for their followers, sort of ended up creating a dynamic that really led to the end of the Roman Republic altogether.
Yeah, they were
So
like two planets just sort of orbiting each other and spinning faster and faster and faster until eventually some sort of conflict was inevitable.
yeah, and Cato was um, an extremely talented politician. I mean, I think this is one of the things I'm trying to show in the book. I think he was a Stoic. That's been doubted sometimes. I think it's clear from very early on in his life he took Stoic philosophy seriously, and I think it guided many of his views about how the Roman Empire, as an empire, should be governed. Um, what you owed to those whom you governed, if you were in the ruling class. But I think he was deeply political too at the same time, and was a master of stunts and sort of building groups of followers and manipulating procedures, and so that made him a real rival for Caesar. And the early parts of the story are sort of delicious when they're hurling insults at each other, and Cato sort of outsmarting Caesar, and but then it has a tragic ending that really neither of them wanted,
Yeah.
and
Well, I
that's
can't
part of
wait.
what's so upsetting about the whole story. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Ryan. It's great to talk with you.
All right, I loved it, and we'll talk at the end of the year about the new book.
Thank you.